Welcome to my channel.
The rain in Loch Dhu did not fall so much as it drifted, a fine, soaking hair that turned the peat-brown hills into ghostly silhouettes and made the waters of the loch look like hammered lead. It was the sort of weather that discouraged movement, which suited Police Constable Hamish Macbeth perfectly. Inside the police station, which was also his kitchen, his parlour, and the occasional bedroom for his lanky dog Lugs, Hamish sat by the peat fire. A pot of coffee, thick enough to float a horseshoe, sat on the stove, and the air smelled of wet wool and wood smoke. Hamish was currently engaged in the delicate task of doing absolutely nothing. His tall, thin frame was draped over a chair, his shock of red hair glowing in the firelight, and his hazel eyes were fixed on a small crack in the ceiling. He had successfully avoided the Morning Post, ignored 3 phone calls from the station in Strathbane, and was currently contemplating whether he could justify a trip to the local hotel for a professional consultation, which usually involved a free sandwich, when the peace was shattered. The sound of a high-performance engine, entirely out of place among the rattling Land Rovers of the village, tore through the mist. It was followed by the screech of brakes and the slamming of a car door. "Hamish! Hamish Macbeth! Are you in there, or have you finally turned into a pillar of salt?" Hamish sighed, a long, weary sound. He knew that voice. It belonged to Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, who acted as the village's unofficial intelligence officer. He opened the door to find Mrs. Wellington standing on his step, her raincoat shimmering with moisture. Behind her, parked at a rakish angle, was a silver Jaguar. Emerging from the car was a man who looked like he had been vacuum-sealed into a tweed suit, 3 sizes too small. He had a face the colour of an overripe plum and a moustache that twitched with imperial irritation. "This, Mrs. Wellington announced, gesturing to the man with a look of profound disapproval, "is Mr. Percival Vane. He has bought the Crags." Hamish felt a cold lump of fear in his stomach. The Crags was a sprawling, draughty Victorian monstrosity on the cliffside that had been mercifully empty for 3 years. "Officer," Vane barked, his accent so clipped it could have cut glass, "I've been in this damp hollow for exactly 48 hours, and I find the security situation appalling. There are locals, ghastly, bearded types, wandering near my boundary walls at night. I expect a full patrol, immediately." Hamish leaned against the doorframe, his expression one of polite, vacant stupidity. "Patrols, is it? Well now, Mr. Vane, the Loch Dhu patrol consists of me and Lugs here, and Lugs have a very sensitive constitution when it comes to humidity." Lugs, as if on cue, let out a mournful wheezing sigh from the fireside. "Listen to me, you Highland bumpkin." Vane stepped closer, smelling of expensive cologne and cheap aggression. "I've spent a fortune on that property. I'm hosting a dinner party tonight for several influential associates from London. If I see one more local poaching my air or looking at my stones, I shall go straight to your chief inspector in Strathbane. Clear?" "Crystal," Hamish drawled, his voice soft and lilting. "But you'll find the locals here are like the midges, Mr. Vane. If you ignore them, they only bite a little bit. If you swat at them, they bring the whole cloud." Vane sneered, spun on his heel and climbed back into his Jaguar, spraying gravel over Hamish's small patch of garden as he roared away. Mrs. Wellington watched him go, her lips pursed. "A Sassenach with more money than sense, Hamish. He's already offended the butcher, told the postmistress her service was quaintly medieval, and tried to tip the minister for a Sunday sermon." "He'll not last the winter," Hamish remarked, his eyes sharpening for just a second before the lazy mask returned. "The Highlands have a way of chewing up men like that, and spitting out the buttons." He didn't know then that Mr. Percival Vane wouldn't even last the night. The following morning the Har had thickened into a soup-like fog that clung to the eaves of the houses and muffled the sound of the Atlantic waves. Hamish Macbeth woke to the persistent, rhythmic thumping of Lug's tail against the floorboards. It was a sound of urgency, though Hamish chose to interpret it as a request for more sleep. He pulled the scratchy wool blanket over his head, hoping to dream of a loch filled with pre-cooked kippers, but the dream was interrupted by a frantic pounding at the station door. This was not the polite tap of a neighbour seeking a lost sheep. It was the staccato drumming of someone who had seen a ghost. With a groan that sounded like a rusty gate, Hamish untangled his long limbs and shuffled to the door in his long johns. He opened it to find Archie McLean, the local handyman, and a man known for a steady nerves and a steadier hand with a poaching net. Looking remarkably pale, Archie's breath came in white plumes, and his hands were trembling so violently that he nearly dropped his cap. "Hamish," Archie wheezed, clutching the doorframe. "You've got to come. Up at the crags. It's that Sassenach, the one with the fancy car and the sour face." Hamish felt a familiar sinking sensation in his chest. It was the feeling of a perfectly good lazy day evaporating into the mist. "What's he done now, Archie? Has he found a spider in his bathtub and decided to call out the militia?" "No, Hamish," Archie said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "He's in the dining room, or what's left of him is. He's sitting at the head of that great long table, surrounded by his London guests, and he's turned a very peculiar shade of blue." Hamish sighed, the sound echoing through the cold kitchen. He thought of the coffee pot, still sitting cold on the stove, and the quiet hour he had planned to spend mending his fishing line. With a heavy heart he pulled on his trousers and his heavy police tunic, laced up his boots, and whistled for lugs. The dog, sensing the change in atmosphere, tucked his tail and followed Hamish out into the grey, damp morning. The walk up to the crags was a steep, lung-burning climb. The Victorian mansion sat perched on a jagged outcropping of rock, looking like a grim fortress designed to keep out the very beauty of the Highlands. As they approached, the silver Jaguar from the previous day sat hunched in the drive, its sleek lines now coated in a layer of grime. The front door stood wide open, a dark maw in the grey stone facade. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of expensive cigars, stale wine, and the unmistakable metallic tang of sudden death. Hamish moved through the foyer, his footsteps heavy on the polished floorboards. He entered the dining room and stopped. It was a scene of grotesque opulence. The long mahogany table was spread with a feast that looked as though it had been interrupted by a thunderbolt. There were platters of half-eaten venison, crystal glasses stained with dregs of claret, and silver candelabra that had burned down to stubs of guttering wax. At the head of the table sat Percival Vane. He was still wearing his tight tweed suit, but his posture was no longer arrogant. He was slumped back in his high-backed chair, his eyes bulging at the ceiling as if in some final, horrified realization. His skin was indeed a mottled, terrifying blue, and his hands were curled into claws on the white linen tablecloth. Around him 4 guests sat in stunned silence, their faces masks of hungover terror. There was a thin man with a nervous twitch in his eye, a woman draped in far too much silk for a Highland morning, and 2 burly men who looked as though they would be more comfortable in a boardroom or a boxing ring. "Morning," Hamish said, his voice deceptively soft, his eyes roaming the room with a sharp, predatory focus that belied his slumped shoulders. "I see the dinner party didn't go quite as planned." The thin man let out a high-pitched whimper. He stood up to make a toast. To the spirit of the North, he called it. He took a bite of his toast, swallowed a sip of his wine, and then he simply collapsed. He turned that colour in seconds, officer. It was like watching a man being strangled by the air itself. Hamish walked slowly around the table. He didn't touch anything, his large hands clasped behind his back. He noticed the piece of toast on Vane's plate. It was smeared with a thick, dark preserve. He also noticed a small silver pot of honey sitting near the victim's hand. Lugs wandered over and sniffed the air near the table, let out a low growl, and retreated to the corner of the room to sit by a heavy velvet curtain. "And who prepared this fine spread?" Hamish asked, eyeing the guests. "He brought his own staff from London. The woman in silk snapped, her voice brittle. A chef and a butler. They've been in the kitchen all morning, refusing to come out. They say they're traumatized. We've been sitting here for 2 hours waiting for someone to do something. Well, I'm doing something now, Hamish replied mildly. I'm looking. He was looking at the way Vane's napkin was tucked into his collar, at the way the wine glass had been overturned, and at the curious absence of any struggle. It was quick, efficient. He looked at the window, which was slightly ajar, letting in a draught of salt air and the sound of the churning sea below. "Archie!" Hamish called out to the handyman, who was hovering nervously in the doorway. "Go down to the hotel. Tell them to call the station in Strathbane. Tell them we have a suspicious occurrence at the Crags. And Archie, tell them to send the big van. We're going to need a lot of room for the evidence." As Archie scrambled away, Hamish pulled a chair away from the table and sat down. He didn't look like a policeman conducting a murder investigation. He looked like a man waiting for a bus. But his mind was racing. Vane had been a man with many enemies, and he had brought 4 of them, along with 2 disgruntled servants, to one of the most isolated spots in Scotland. The peace of Loch Dhu had been broken, and worse still, the murder had been committed with a theatricality that would surely bring the heavy-handed wrath of the Strathbane CI down upon the village. Hamish could already hear the sirens in his mind, and with them, the shouting, red-faced fury of DCI Blair. He looked at Vane's blue face and sighed. "You couldn't just have a heart attack in London, could you, Mr. Vane?" Hamish muttered under his breath. "You had to make a production of it." He reached out and very gently picked up a silver spoon, peering at the reflection of his own weary face in the polished metal. The investigation had begun, and his quiet life was officially over. The silence of the dining room at the Crags was not destined to last, and Hamish Macbeth knew it with a heavy, sinking certainty. He remained seated, his long legs stretched out toward the dead man, watching the guests with a gaze that seemed vacant, but was actually cataloguing every bead of sweat and every nervous glance toward the heavy oak doors. The woman in the silk dress was nursing a glass of water with trembling fingers, while the 2 burly men whispered urgently in a corner, their bravado from the previous night having vanished along with their host's pulse. Just as Hamish was considering the possibility of a quiet cup of tea before the storm broke, the storm arrived in the form of a screeching police convoy. The sirens wailed up the winding cliff road, echoing off the stone walls of the mansion like the cries of banshees. Moments later, the front doors were flung open with enough force to rattle the crystal. Detective Chief Inspector Blair stormed the room. Blair was a man who appeared to be composed entirely of high blood pressure and cheap polyester. His face was already a dangerous shade of crimson, and his small pig-like eyes scanned the room with immediate hostility. Behind him trailed his usual retinue of detectives, looking miserable and damp, and the long-suffering Jimmy Anderson, who gave Hamish a subtle, sympathetic nod. Blair ignored the body for a full 5 seconds, choosing instead to focus his vitriol on the local constable who was sitting comfortably in the presence of a corpse. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, the sound bouncing off the high Victorian ceiling. "I might have known. I get a report of a high-profile death in this god-forsaken heap of rocks, and what do I find? The village idiot resting in the middle of a crime scene. Get up, you useless streak of Highland misery. Have you touched anything? Have you contaminated the whole place with your sheep-smelling presence?" Hamish rose slowly, his movements deliberate and languid, unfolding himself like a deck chair. He kept his expression one of mild, baffled innocence, the mask he always wore when dealing with the hierarchy from Strathbane. "I was just keeping an eye on things, sir, making sure the guests stayed put and that lugs didn't get too close to the venison. It's a sad business, truly. Mr. Vane here was only just telling me yesterday how much he valued security." Blair pushed past him, nearly knocking Hamish over, and stomped toward the head of the table. He peered at the blue-tinted face of Percival Vane with a mixture of professional greed and personal disgust. "Look at this," Blair barked at Anderson. "Cyanide. Has to be. or some kind of industrial poison. It's a classic hit. Professional. Probably one of these London types brought their urban grudges north. And you, Macbeth, probably sat here and watched him drink it while you were dreaming of poaching salmon. He was eating toast, sir, Hamish offered gently, pointing a long finger at the silver rack, and a bit of honey. The guests say he was making a toast to the north when he turned that peculiar colour. It was all very sudden. I didn't ask for a culinary review, Blair snapped, turning his fury on the guests. Right, you lot. Into the drawing room. Now. I want statements, I want passports, and I want to know which one of you had the most to gain from seeing this arrogant Sassenach kick the bucket. Move! The guests scrambled to obey, grateful to escape the presence of the corpse, but terrified of the man now in charge. As they filed out, Blair turned back to Hamish, his lip curling. As for you, Macbeth, you can make yourself useful for once. Go and stand by the front gate. Don't let any of those parasitic reporters through, and for heaven's sake, try to look like a policeman instead of a wandering crofter. I don't want you anywhere near the actual investigation. This is a CID matter now. It's far too complex for a man who spends his days talking to cows. Hamish nodded obediently, though his eyes lingered for a second on the silver honey pot. He had noticed something Blair had missed in his rush to be important. The lid of the honey pot was slightly ajar, and there was a tiny sticky smear on the tablecloth that didn't match the position of the victim's hands. Moreover, a single dead bee lay on the floor near Lug's paws, its wings unnaturally crumpled. "I'll be at the gate then, sir," Hamish said, his voice a soft, musical lilt. "Though it's a bit of a trek in this rain. If you need me for any local knowledge, who might have been wandering the cliffs last night, or who in the village has a particular skill with herbs, you'll know where to find me." "Herbs? Don't be ridiculous," Blair scoffed, waving him away. "This is a modern murder, Macbeth. We'll have the lab results from Strathbane before you've even finished your next nap. Now get out before I have you suspended for general incompetence." Hamish whistled for Lugs and walked out of the dining room, his head bowed as if in shame. But once he reached the hallway, his posture changed. The vacancy in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sharp, calculating intelligence. He knew Blair would spend the next several hours bullying the guests and looking for a professional motive, a business deal gone wrong, or a secret inheritance. Blair liked his crimes to be loud and obvious like himself. But Hamish knew the Highlands. He knew that in a place where the winter was long and gossip was the only thing that stayed warm, motives were rarely about international finance. They were about the small, stinging slights that festered in the damp air. He walked past the kitchen, noting the sound of a chef weeping loudly and a butler arguing with a junior detective about the proper way to handle bone china. Stepping out into the rain, Hamish didn't head for the gate. Instead, he took a narrow path that led around the side of the mansion, toward the overgrown gardens that clung to the cliffside. He wanted to see where those locals Mr. Vane had complained about had been wandering. If someone had been poaching near the crags, they would have seen more than any London dinner guest, and more importantly, Hamish wanted to know where this honey had come from. In Lochdu, everyone knew who kept the bees, and everyone knew that bees were far more predictable than men from London. As he moved through the mist, Lugs at his heels, Hamish felt the first real spark of interest. It was going to be a long, wet, and thoroughly interesting day. The heavy iron gates of the crags groaned behind Hamish as he descended the cliff path, leaving the frantic barking of DCI Blair's orders to be swallowed by the Atlantic gale. To any observer, the tall, ginger-haired policeman looked defeated, a man sent to perform the lowly task of sentry duty in the driving rain. In reality, Hamish was moving with a purposeful stride that his superiors would have found suspicious. He knew that the answers to Percival Vane's blue-tinted demise would not be found in the aggressive interrogations currently taking place in the drawing room. Blair would spend his time looking for high-stakes blackmail or London gangland connections, but Hamish was more interested in the dead bee he had seen on the floor and the peculiar cloying scent of the honey. He made his way down into the heart of Loch Dhu, where the village huddled against the loch like a group of damp sheep. His first stop was not the police station, but the back door of the Loch Dhu Hotel. He knew that Mrs. Curry, the proprietor, would have her ear to the ground and a pot of tea on the range. As he entered the warm, steam-filled kitchen, the smell of baking bread and roasting lamb washed over him, a welcome relief from the metallic tang of the death chamber on the hill. Mrs. Curry was currently pummeling a mound of dough with enough force to suggest she was imagining it was a tax inspector's face. "So the Sassenach has gone to his maker," she said without looking up. "And about time, too. He was a man who thought the world was his private footstool. Sit down, Hamish. You look like a drowned rat, and your lungs look worse." Hamish slid into a wooden chair, while Luggs immediately took up residence under the warm stove. "It was a messy business, Mrs. Curry, very sudden and very blue. DCI Blair is up there now, making a noise like a broken steam engine. He's convinced it's a professional hit from the city." Mrs. Curry paused her kneading, her floury hands resting on the counter. City hit? Rubbish. Percival Vane hadn't been here a week, and he'd already managed to insult every living soul within 5 miles. He told the postmistress her eyesight was failing because she took a second too long to find his registered mail. He told old Angus that his sheep were a blot on the landscape. But it was the honey that did him in, wasn't it? Hamish's hazel eyes sharpened. "Honey. Now what makes you say that, Mrs. Curry?" "Because he was obsessed with it," she replied, resuming her work. "He came in here demanding local artisanal heather honey, said the stuff in the shops was fit only for peasants. He went up to see Mrs. Kennedy at the edge of the moor. She has the best hives in the county, though she's a woman with a temper like a disturbed hornet's nest." Hamish nodded slowly. Mrs. Kennedy was a recluse who lived in a cottage that seemed to be held together by ivy and spite. She was also a woman who knew more about poisons and natural remedies than most Strathbane doctors. "And did he get his honey?" "Oh, he got it," Mrs. Curry said with a grim smile, "but not before he'd called her cottage a hovel and suggested she move her hives because they were unsightly. She told him to find his sweetness elsewhere, but then, curiously enough, she sent her nephew down to the crags yesterday with a special jar. A peace offering, she called it. Though if Mrs. Kennedy is offering peace, I'd be checking the ground for a trap door." Hamish took a long sip of the tea Mrs. Curry placed before him. The information was vital, yet he knew he couldn't simply hand it to Blair. If he did, Blair would arrest Mrs. Kennedy, charge her with murder, and Hamish would be commended, a fate he feared more than the rain. A commendation led to promotion, and promotion led to a desk in the grey concrete heart of Glasgow or Strathbane. He needed to find the truth, but he needed to ensure it was the kind of truth that Blair would somehow manage to claim as his own accidental discovery. Leaving the hotel, Hamish wandered toward the post office. The village was humming with the news. Groups of men in flat caps stood on street corners, their voices low as they watched the police cars racing back and forth. To them, Hamish was just poor Hamish, the man being bullied by the big city detectives. He played the part well, stopping to chat about the weather and the price of wool, all the while listening for the gaps in their stories. He learned that Vaughan's guests weren't just business associates, they were people he had cheated in a property deal 3 years ago. Vaughan had invited them to the Highlands not to apologize, but to gloat about his new estate. He was a man who enjoyed the taste of other people's misery. The postmistress, Mrs. Ross, whispered as she handed Hamish a tin of tobacco he hadn't asked for. "But someone gave him a taste of something else last night. They say his tongue blackened, Hamish. Is that true?" "It was more of a navy blue, Mrs. Ross," Hamish corrected mildly. "Like a very expensive fountain pen." As he walked back toward the sea wall, Hamish considered the dynamics. Mrs. Kennedy had the means and the motive of a slighted local. The guests had motive for financial ruin. But there was something about the way the honeypot had been sitting on that table, just slightly out of reach of the guests, but perfectly placed for the host. It was a targeted strike. And then there was the matter the locals Vane had seen wandering his grounds. Hamish pulled his collar up against a fresh gust of wind. He needed to speak to someone who saw everything but said nothing. He needed to speak to Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She would be at the Halberton Smythe estate, likely hosting some equally bored members of the gentry. She had a knack for understanding the cruelties of the upper class that Hamish, for all his intuition, sometimes found baffling. As he turned his steps toward the grand gates of the Halberton Smythe lands, he felt the weight of the investigation pressing down. Blair would be looking for a smoking gun, but Hamish was looking for a bit of flour. He knew that in the Highlands, the most dangerous things often grew in the prettiest gardens, and the sweetest gifts were often the most deadly. He just had to figure out who had delivered the jar, and why they had been so sure that Percival Vane wouldn't be able to resist one last greedy taste of Loch Dhu. The drive up the long, gravelled sweep of the Halberton Smythe estate was a stark contrast to the jagged, salt-sprayed cliffs of the crags. Here the Highland wilderness had been beaten into submission by centuries of inherited wealth and careful landscaping. Even the mist seemed more refined, clinging to the ancient oaks with a decorative grace rather than the suffocating dampness of the village below. Hamish Macbeth parked his battered Land Rover near the stables, mindful of the fact that his vehicle looked like a motorized scrap heap compared to the polished Range Rovers of the guests. Luggs remained in the passenger seat, his chin resting on the dashboard, watching the estate's peacocks with a look of profound canine boredom. Hamish straightened his tie in the rearview mirror, wiped a smudge of peat from his cheek, and set off toward the manor house, his heart heavy with the impending social requirements of his visit. He found Priscilla Halberton Smythe in the rose garden, which was currently a skeletal maze of thorny stems and damp earth. She was wearing a Barber jacket and a pair of green Wellington boots that managed to look elegant despite the mud. Priscilla was the one woman in the Highlands who could make Hamish feel simultaneously completely at home and entirely out of his depth. She looked up as he approached, her cool blue eyes taking in his dishevelled appearance with a flicker of amusement that she quickly suppressed. She had heard the news, of course. News in Loch Dhu travelled faster than a gale-force wind off the Minch. "I wondered how long it would take for you to find your way here, Hamish," she said, her voice like silk over gravel. "I assume you're not here to discuss the state of my father's prize rhododendrons. The word from the village is that Percival Vane has managed to get himself murdered in a most dramatic fashion." Hamish leaned against a stone sundial, his posture returning to its habitual deceptive slump. "It was dramatic enough, Priscilla. He's sitting up at the crags looking like a piece of overboiled indigo. DCI Blair is currently tearing the house apart looking for London gangsters. But I have a feeling the truth is a bit more local." Priscilla sighed, snipping a dead flower head from a bush with a sharp click of her shears. "Percival was a beastly man, Hamish. My father had him over for drinks when he first arrived, mostly out of a sense of obligation to the neighbourly arts, and he spent the entire evening explaining how he intended to modernise the local economy. He actually suggested turning the harbour into a private marina for luxury yachts. He saw the people here as stage dressing for his own personal drama. He was particularly interested in honey," Hamish remarked, watching her closely. "Mrs. Curry says he was quite obsessed with getting the best heather honey in the district. He even visited Mrs. Kennedy." Priscilla paused, her shears hovering in mid-air. "Mrs. Kennedy? That was a mistake. She's a proud woman, and she takes her apiary very seriously. But Percival wouldn't have understood that. He thought everything had a price tag, and everyone was a servant. But there's something you should know about those guests of his, Hamish. They aren't just business associates he cheated. 2 of them, the Jenkins brothers, are actually related to the old family that owned the crags before the bank foreclosed. They feel that Vane didn't just buy their home, he stole their heritage. Hamish rubbed his chin, the stubble rasping in the quiet garden. Inheritance and heritage. It's a powerful cocktail, Priscilla. But would they kill him in his own dining room with a jar of honey? It seems a bit poetic for a property dispute. Perhaps, Priscilla conceded, stepping closer to him. Her scent, a mix of expensive perfume and damp earth, momentarily distracted him from the blue face of the corpse. But you're looking at it like a policeman, Hamish. Look at it like a social climber. Vane was desperate to be accepted by the county set. He was a Sassenach who wanted to play the laird. He would have eaten or drunk anything if he thought it was the height of local tradition. If someone told him that eating a specific, rare type of honey was the secret to being a true Highlander, he'd have swallowed the whole jar.
A rare honey, Hamish mused.
Like the midnight toast the guest mentioned. He was making a toast to the north. Exactly, Priscilla said, her expression turning serious. But there's a rumour among the old families, Hamish. My father mentioned it once. There's a particular type of rhododendron, the ponticum, that grows wild on the cliffs near the crags. If bees forage too heavily on it during a late cold spring, the honey they produce can be mad. It contains grey-anotoxins. In small amounts it's hallucinogenic. In a concentrated form, and if the victim has a weak heart or a particular sensitivity, it turns them blue. Hamish finished the thought, his mind racing. And it kills them fast. It wouldn't need a professional assassin from London. Just someone who knew the land, knew the hives, and knew exactly how greedy Percival Vane was. Priscilla nodded. But there's a catch. Mrs. Kennedy's hives are nowhere near the Ponticum groves. Someone would have had to move a hive, or manually mix the toxins into a specific jar. It required knowledge, Hamish. Local knowledge and a very cold heart. Hamish looked out toward the grey horizon where the sea met the sky. The pieces were beginning to shift in his mind. The arrogant outsider, the vengeful relatives, the insulted herbalist, and a landscape that provided its own weapons. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of sympathy for the dead man, despite his arrogance. To be killed by the very beauty you were trying to buy was a dark irony, even for the Highlands. I should get back, Hamish said softly. Blair will be wondering why I haven't checked in at the gate. If he finds out I've been socializing with the landed gentry while he's been shouting at suspects, he'll have my head on a platter. Be careful, Hamish, Priscilla said, her hand briefly touching his arm. Whoever did this didn't just kill a man. They did it with a terrifying amount of patience. That kind of person doesn't like being found out by a village policeman. Hamish gave her a small, lopsided smile and turned back toward his Land Rover. As he drove away, the image of the dead bee on the dining room floor returned to him. It hadn't died of old age. It had been a messenger, and he was finally beginning to understand the message. He needed to find out who had been wandering those cliffs at night, and he needed to do it before DCI Blair arrested the first person he saw with a London accent. The drive back from the Halbert and Smythe estate felt longer than usual, the wheels of the Land Rover splashing through deepening puddles that mirrored the leaden sky. Hamish's mind was occupied by the image of the rhododendron ponticum, that beautiful invasive purple flower that clung to the Scottish cliffs like a toxic crown. If Priscilla was right, the murder weapon hadn't been a vial of poison smuggled from a city lab, but the very soil of Loch Dhu itself. As he crested the hill overlooking the village, the flashing blue lights of several police cruisers outside the local pub, the Loch Dhu Arms, told him that DCI Blair had moved on from the crime scene to his favourite secondary activity, making a public spectacle of an arrest. Hamish pulled over, his boots squelching as he stepped onto the pavement. A small crowd of villagers had gathered, their faces grim and set against the wind. In the centre of the fray stood DCI Blair, his face now a shade of purple that rivaled the toxic rhododendrons. He had his meaty hand clamped firmly onto the shoulder of Archie MacLean's nephew Geordie, a lad of 20 with a penchant for wandering the hills and a reputation for being slightly away with the fairies. Geordie was trembling, his eyes wide with a terror that made him look even more guilty to an outsider like Blair. "I've got him, Macbeth," Blair bellowed as Hamish approached. "Found the link." This little gutter snipe was seen delivering a package to the Crags yesterday evening. A jar of honey, wasn't it, lad? A nice, lethal peace offering from your auntie. We found a similar jar in the pantry with traces of what looks like a botanical toxin. I'm arresting him as an accessory to murder, and his aunt is next. It's a classic local conspiracy. The peasants revolted against the new landlord. "Now just a minute, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into its most placid, subservient register. He took off his peaked cap and scratched his head, looking every bit the confused country bobby. "Geordie here might have delivered a jar, but the lad's got no more malice in him than a day-old lamb. And Mrs. Kennedy, well, she's a prickly one, but she prizes her reputation for honey above all else. Why would she send a jar that would lead the police right to her doorstep? It doesn't seem very logical, does it? Logic? What do you know about logic?" Blair sneered, shoving Geordie toward a waiting van. The boy was seen on the security cameras Vane had installed. He sneaked up to the back door, left the jar, and ran off. Motive: revenge for insulting their cottage. It's open and shut. I'll have a confession out of him before the sun sets, though judging by this weather, that's not saying much. Hamish watched as the van doors slammed shut. He felt a sharp pang of annoyance. Blair was so blinded by his own desire for a quick result that he was ignoring the glaring inconsistencies. Hamish approached the silver Jaguar, which was now being towed away, and then glanced back at the crowd. He spotted the two Jenkins brothers, the relatives of the former owners Priscilla had mentioned, standing at the edge of the pier. They weren't looking at the police, they were looking at each other, and there was a strange, silent communication passing between them that didn't sit right with Hamish. "Sir," Hamish tried again, entering Blair's path, "before you head back to Strathbane, there's a small matter. I noticed something in the dining room. A dead bee. Now, a bee doesn't just die in a warm room in the middle of a dinner party unless it's been exposed to something very strong. And that bee was no heather honeybee. It was smaller, darker. It looked like the kind that nests in the old stone walls down by the harbour." Blair leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and aggression. "A bee, Macbeth? You're bringing me a dead insect as evidence? I'm building a case on forensic sightings and delivery logs, and you're playing at being David Attenborough. Get out of my sight. Go find a lost cat or something equally suited to your intellect. I'm taking the boy in." As the convoy roared out of the village, leaving a trail of exhaust and resentment, Hamish stood in the rain, silent. He knew Geordie was innocent. The boy had delivered a jar of honey, yes, but Hamish suspected the jar Geordie delivered wasn't the one that ended up on Percival Vane's toast. He walked over to where the Jenkins brothers had been standing, but they had already vanished into the mist. He decided it was time for a more direct approach. He didn't go to the police station. Instead, he walked toward the old harbour wall, where the salt spray stung his eyes and the wind whipped his hair. He remembered something Percival Vane had said, that he had seen locals wandering near his walls at night. If Geordie had delivered the jar in the evening, someone could have easily intercepted it or swapped it before it ever reached the breakfast table. But who would have access to the Ponticum toxin and a reason to frame the local honeymaker? Hamish stopped at a small, weathered cottage near the quay. It belonged to the village's retired schoolmaster, a man who had spent 40 years teaching the children of Loch Dhu about the flora and fauna of the Highlands. If anyone knew the exact properties of mad honey, and who had been asking about it lately, it would be him. But as Hamish reached for the knocker, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. A cold shiver, unrelated to the wind, ran down his spine. Lugs let out a low, vibrating growl from behind him. The investigation was no longer just about a dead Sassenach and a bullied local lad. The stakes were shifting, and Hamish realised that by dismissing him, Blair had left the most dangerous part of the case entirely in Hamish's hands. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in the gale, and stepped into the shadows. He needed to find the missing link between the Cliffs, the Honey, and the Jenkins brothers before Blair's open and shut case resulted in a permanent injustice. The interior of the schoolmaster's cottage was a claustrophobic maze of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and dried botanical specimens pinned to corkboards like skeletal remains. Mr. Henderson, the retired teacher, was sitting in his armchair by a dead fire, looking shaken but unharmed. On the low table before him sat a half-empty bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the sharp medicinal tang of the very plants Hamish had been contemplating. Henderson looked up, his eyes watery behind thick spectacles, and he didn't seem surprised to see the village constable, standing in his doorway with a soaking wet dog. "He was just here, Hamish," Henderson whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "One of the Jenkins boys, Arthur. He didn't come for a history lesson. He came to ensure I kept my mouth shut about the old maps. He was quite forceful." Hamish sat down opposite the old man, gestured for Lugs to lie still, and poured himself a small measure of the whiskey. He needed the warmth, but more than that, he needed the schoolmaster to feel that this was just another village chat. "The old maps, Mr. Henderson? I wouldn't have thought the Jenkins family took much interest in cartography. They always seemed more interested in the price of beef and the strength of their lager." Henderson leaned forward, his hands trembling as they gripped the arms of his chair. "It isn't about the land as it is now, Hamish. It's about what the land was. You see, the Jenkins family didn't just lose the crags to the bank. They lost it because Percival Vane found a loophole in the old crofting boundaries. He discovered that a specific strip of the cliffside, the part where the ponticum grows thickest, had never been formally deeded in the 19th century. He used his London lawyers to snatch it away, effectively cutting off the Jenkins' access to the only natural spring on the property. He didn't just buy their house, he strangled their livelihood out of pure, calculated greed. Hamish took a sip of the whiskey, feeling it burn a path down to his stomach. So it wasn't just a property dispute. It was a slow execution of a family's legacy. But why the honey, Mr. Henderson? Why such a convoluted way to see him off? "Because of the poetry of it, Hamish," Henderson replied, a strange flicker of academic interest crossing his tired face. "The Jenkins family has kept bees on those cliffs for 4 generations. They knew about the Grayana toxins. They knew that in a particularly cold spring the bees have nothing else to feed but rhododendrons. It's a known danger to the locals, something we teach the children to avoid. But to an outsider like Van, who demanded wild and pure Highland products, it was the perfect bait. Arthur Jenkins didn't just want him dead, he wanted him killed by the very land he had stolen. The puzzle pieces began to click into place with a sickening finality. Hamish thought back to the locals Vane had complained about. They hadn't been poaching salmon or deer, they'd been tending to a specific isolated hive hidden among the toxic purple blooms of the cliffside. The jar Geordie had delivered was perfectly innocent, the peace offering from Mrs. Kennedy, but someone had been waiting in the shadows of the mansion's service entrance, someone who knew the butler's routine and pantry layout. They had swapped the jars, replacing the wholesome heather honey with the concentrated essence of Highland spite. "Blair has Geordie in a cell in Strathbane," Hamish said softly, his hazel eyes fixed on the cold grate of the fireplace. "He thinks he's solved it. He thinks the boy and his aunt are the conspirators. If I go to him with this, he'll just say I'm spinning tales to protect my own. He wants a villain he can understand, not a story about botanical toxins and century-old land deeds." "Then you must show him, not tell him," Henderson said, his voice regaining some of its former authority. "Arthur Jenkins is a proud man, Hamish. Too proud for his own good. He kept a journal of the hive's progress. He saw it as a great job justice. He's hiding it at the old sheep tank near the cliff edge. He thinks nobody would ever look there, certainly not a lazy policeman from the village." Hamish stood up, his tall frame nearly brushing the low-beamed ceiling. The darkness under the narrative was now fully visible. This wasn't a crime of passion or a city hit. It was a cold, calculated act of ancestral revenge that had used an innocent boy as a shield. The pettiness of it, the way Varney's arrogance had met Jenkins's stubborn, lethal pride, was typical of the grudges that could grow in the isolation of the Highlands. "I'll be going now, Mr. Henderson," Hamish said, settling his cap back on his head. "And if anyone asks, we were just discussing the history of the parish. It wouldn't do for Arthur to think you've been talking out of school." As he stepped back out into the rain, the wind had shifted to the north, bringing a biting chill that promised snow. Hamish didn't head for his Land Rover. He knew the Jenkins brothers would be watching the road. Instead, he took the back sheep tracks, moving with a silent feline grace through the heather that would have baffled his superiors in Strathbane. Lugs followed, a dark shadow in the mist. Hamish realized he couldn't just arrest Arthur Jenkins. If he did, the legal battle would be long, the evidence would be contested by expensive lawyers, and Geordie's reputation would be permanently stained by the association. No, he needed something more definitive. He needed a way to make Arthur reveal himself in a way that even DCI Blair couldn't ignore. He needed to set a trap that played on the very thing that had caused this mess, the killer's utter contempt for the stupid local policeman. As he climbed toward the cliffs, Hamish began to formulate a plan that involved a bit of theatre, a fake clue, and the one thing Percival Vane had left behind, a sense of theatrical greed. The confrontation was coming, and Hamish Macbeth, for all his deceptive laziness, felt the adrenaline of the hunt. He would save the lad, he would humiliate Blair, and he would do it all without ever raising his voice above a soft Highland lilt. He reached the ridge and looked down at the dark, churning waters where Van's life had ended and the Jenkins revenge had begun. It was time to put the lid on the honeypot, once and for all. The north wind howled across the ridge, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the weight of every ancient grudge buried in the Highland soil. Hamish Macbeth crouched low in the heather, his figure nearly invisible against the darkening moor. He watched the silhouette of the old sheep fank, a crumbling stone enclosure that had stood since the clearances, now serving as a silent witness to a very modern malice. Beside him, Lugs lay perfectly still, his ears pricked and his black nose twitching as he filtered the scent of wet stone and salt from the more subtle aromas of the hillside. Hamish knew that Arthur Jenkins would be watching the main road for the flash of police lights or the heavy tread of Blair's boots, but the man would never expect the local constable to approach from the sea cliffs, moving through the treacherous terrain like a stag in the mist. Hamish reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass jar he had retrieved from his own larder earlier that afternoon. It was filled with nothing more dangerous than supermarket syrup, but in the dim, deceptive light of the gloaming, it looked identical to the peace offering that had sat on Percival Vane's table. He needed Arthur to believe that the evidence Blair was currently gloating over in Strathbane was a decoy, and that the real incriminating jar, the one with the lingering traces of grey anatoxin, was still out here, undiscovered by the city police. It was a gamble that relied entirely on Arthur's pride and his profound underestimation of Hamish's wits. He began his performance not with a shout, but with a deliberate, clumsy stumble. He allowed himself to be seen for a fleeting second as he crossed a patch of open ground, waving a flashlight around with the haphazard curiosity of a man who didn't quite know what he was looking for. He let out a loud, frustrated sigh that carried on the wind, a sound of a weary policeman who just wanted to go home to his tea. Then, leaning against a jagged standing stone within earshot of the fank, Hamish spoke aloud. His voice was loud enough to reach any hidden ears. "Och, Lugs, it's a fool's errand we're on," Hamish grumbled, his Highland lilt thick and lazy. That man Blair thinks he's so clever with his forensic labs and his shouting, but he's missed the whole point. He's got the boy Geordie in a cell, but he's forgotten about the second jar, the one the butler saw being swapped at the pantry window. If I can just find where that Jenkins fellow hid the real poison, I can take it straight to the chief constable in Inverness. I'll skip Blair entirely. I'll be the hero of the day, and maybe they'll finally give me that pay raise so I can buy you some decent biscuits." He paused, clicking his flashlight on and off as if the batteries were dying. He then placed the decoy jar on a flat stone near the entrance to the tank, making sure the glass caught the last sliver of grey light from the horizon. He moved away a few yards, pretending to examine a clump of gorse, his back turned to the stone enclosure. It was the ultimate bait: a lonely policeman, a distracted dog, and the supposedly real evidence sitting out in the open, ready to be reclaimed or destroyed. For a long minute, the only sound was the rhythmic thumping of the waves against the cliffs below. Then, the silence of the moor was broken by the soft rhythmic crunch of boots on lichen. From the shadows of the sheep flank, a tall, broad-shouldered figure emerged. Arthur Jenkins moved with a frantic, desperate energy, his face a mask of sweating anxiety. He didn't look like a master criminal. He looked like a man who had spent his life resenting his betters and had finally been consumed by the fire of his own bitterness. He made a direct line for the jar on the stone, his hand outstretched like a claw. "You stupid red-headed peasant," Arthur hissed under his breath, his voice trembling with a mixture of relief and rage. "You think you can just wander up here and take what belongs to the land? Vane took our house, and you did nothing. You let the lawyers and the banks pick us clean. Well, the bees did what the law wouldn't, and now you're going to give me that jar and go back to your kitchen before you get hurt." Hamish didn't turn around immediately. He stayed bent over the gorse, his voice remaining calm, almost conversational. "It's a beautiful thing, the rhododendron ponticum, Arthur. A bit invasive, mind you. It chokes out the native plants, much like Mr. Vane tried to choke out the village. But it's a terrible thing to use it to kill a man. It's a messy way to die, turning blue like that. It lacks the dignity the Jenkins family used to be known for." Arthur froze, his fingers inches from the glass jar. "How did you—" He stopped, his eyes darting around the empty moor. "It doesn't matter what you think you know. Blair has the boy. The case is closed. Everyone knows the Kennedys are crazy. By the time they realize the honey in the station is just heather honey, I'll have disposed of the real thing and been halfway to Ireland. Is that right?" Hamish said, finally straightening up and turning to face the killer. The lazy mask was gone. In its place was a cold, hard authority that seemed to radiate from him, making him appear taller and more formidable in the twilight. "But you see, Arthur, I'm not a very good policeman. I don't like paperwork, and I hate going to court in Strathbane, so I thought I'd make it easy for everyone. I told Jimmy Anderson, who's a much better friend than he is a detective, to follow me at a distance, and I told him that if I started talking to the air about heroes and Inverness, he should probably start recording. From behind a nearby hillock, the tall, thin figure of Detective Jimmy Anderson emerged, looking deeply uncomfortable, but holding a small digital recorder aloft. Behind him, the unmistakable silhouette of a police van appeared, its lights off but its presence undeniable. Arthur Jenkins looked from Hamish to the jar, then back to the darkness of the moor. The realization that he had been outmaneuvered by the man he considered the village idiot hit him like a physical blow. His face went from pale to a livid mottled red. "You set me up. You played the fool just to get me to talk." "I didn't have to play much, Arthur," Hamish said sadly. "You were so sure I was a bumpkin that you did all the work for me. You couldn't resist coming out to see the stupid policeman lose his prize. Pride is a more dangerous poison than any rhododendron, I think." Arthur's hand went to the heavy iron wrench he carried in his belt, his eyes turning predatory. He looked at Hamish, then at the distant Jimmy Anderson, and weighed his chances. He was a powerful man, fueled by decades of grievance, and the cliff edge was only a few yards away. The air grew thick with the tension of a cornered animal deciding whether to cower or strike. Hamish shifted his weight, his large hands relaxed but ready, his hazel eyes never leaving Arthur's face. He knew the next few seconds would determine whether this ended with a quiet arrest or a violent struggle on the edge of the abyss. "Don't do it, Arthur," Hamish warned, his voice dropping to a low, commanding growl. "Lugs here hasn't had his dinner, and he's got a very low tolerance for people who threaten his master. Just put the wrench down. We can walk back to the village, and we can talk about the land deeds. We can talk about what Vane did. But if you move toward me, the grace of the Highlands is finished for you." The wind surged again, throwing a curtain of spray over the ridge. Arthur Jenkins stood poised on the brink of a terrible decision, the silver jar reflecting the cold, indifferent stars above. The trap had sprung, but the prey was not yet secured, and in the shadows of Loch Dhu, even the best-laid plans had a way of turning as bitter as the honey that had started it all. The wind shrieked with a sudden, banshee-like intensity as Arthur Jenkins made his choice. It was not the choice of a man seeking a peaceful resolution, but the desperate, flailing strike of a cornered beast who realized his world had finally collapsed. With a guttural roar that was half sob and half battle cry, Arthur lunged. He didn't go for the jar on the stone, he went for Hamish. The heavy iron wrench he had been gripping was raised high, catching the faint ghostly light of the rising moon as it swung in a murderous arc toward Hamish's head. Hamish Macbeth, usually seen leaning lazily against a door frame or shuffling slowly through the village mire, moved with a speed that would have shocked anyone who didn't know the lean muscle hidden beneath his oversized police tunic. He didn't retreat. Instead, he stepped into the attack, pivoting on the ball of his lead foot. The wrench whistled through the air, inches from his ear, but Hamish was already inside Arthur's reach. He slammed a large, calloused hand against Arthur's chest, using the man's own momentum to off-balance him. "Enough of this, Arthur!" Hamish shouted over the gale, his voice losing its soft lilt and taking on a sharp, metallic edge. "You've done enough damage to this village and to your own soul." But Arthur was beyond listening. He was a broad man, built from years of hauling stones and wrestling sheep, and he outweighed Hamish by at least 3 stones of solid, angry muscle. He recovered his footing on the slick heather and charged again, lower this time, aiming to tackle Hamish toward the precipice. The cliff edge was only 10 feet away, a jagged drop into a boiling cauldron of black Atlantic water and razor-sharp rocks. One slip from either man would mean a messy end that no doctor in Strathbane could fix. Lugs, usually the most pacifistic of creatures, decided that the time for observation had ended. With a fierce, vibrating snarl that sounded like a tectonic plate shifting, the dog launched himself. He didn't bite, but he struck Arthur's thigh with the full weight of his lanky body, momentarily breaking the man's concentration. Arthur stumbled, his boots skidding on the greasy mud, and the wrench flew from his hand, clattering harmlessly into a thicket of gorse. Hamish saw his opening. He moved in with the economical grace of a Highland wrestler. He caught Arthur's arm, twisted it behind his back with a sudden, painful wrench, and forced the man face down into the damp peat. It was a struggle of pure endurance. Arthur thrashed and cursed, his face pressed into the heather, crying out about the stolen land, the dead ancestors, and the injustice of a world that protected men like Percival Vane. "Steady now, man," Hamish grunted, pinning Arthur down with a knee between his shoulder blades. "The land is still here. It'll be here long after you and I and Vane are nothing but dust. You didn't save it by killing him. You only gave the lawyers more reasons to pick the bones clean." Jimmy Anderson arrived then, breathless and sliding down the embankment, his face pale with shock. He had been a policeman for 20 years, but most of his experience involved filling out forms in a warm office or breaking up the occasional Saturday night scuffle outside the pub. Seeing the lazy Hamish Macbeth physically subduing a man twice his width was a sight he wasn't entirely prepared for. "I've got the recording, Hamish," Jimmy shouted, his voice shaking. He confessed, "I heard every word about the second jar and the pantry window, but my God, I thought he was going to take you over the edge." "He tried his best, Jimmy," Hamish said, his breathing heavy but controlled. He reached for his handcuffs, the shiny silver pair he usually kept at the bottom of a drawer, and snapped them onto Arthur's wrists. The metallic click seemed to signal the end of the fury. Arthur stopped struggling, his body going limp as the adrenaline drained away, replaced by the cold, hollow realization of what he had done. He began to weep, a harsh, dry sound that was swallowed by the roar of the sea. Hamish stood up, brushing the peat and heather from his trousers. He looked down at the decoy jar on the stone, then at the sprawling darkness of the crags in the distance. The lights of the mansion were still burning, a hollow testament to a man who had tried to buy a piece of the Highlands and found only a grave. "We need to get him down to the van, Jimmy," Hamish said, his voice returning to its usual quiet tone. "And we need to do it before Blair finds out we've been playing games on the cliffside. If he thinks we went behind his back to secure a confession, he'll have a stroke, and I'm not in the mood to deal with 2 medical emergencies in one night." "He'll find out eventually, Hamish," Jimmy said, helping the broken Arthur Jenkins to his feet. "He's already in a foul mood because the lab results from the first jar came back as perfectly normal heather honey. He's up at the station now, trying to bully Geordie into saying he spiked it with something else. When he hears we've got the real killer and the motive—" "He won't hear it from me," Hamish interrupted, a small, cunning smile playing across his lips. "He's going to hear it from you, Jimmy. You're going to be the one who intuited that the Jenkins brothers might be involved. You're the one who followed a lead about the old land deeds. I was just the local bobby who happened to be nearby when you made the arrest." Jimmy looked at Hamish in disbelief. "But you did everything. You set the trap. You found the toxin. You fought him on the edge of a cliff. Why would you give the credit away?" Hamish looked out over the loch, where the first lights of the village were flickering in the gloom. He thought of his warm kitchen, the smell of his coffee pot, and the long, uninterrupted hours of silence he hoped to reclaim. He thought of the grey, stifling offices in Strathbane and the promotion that would surely follow if he were credited with solving a high-profile murder. "Because, Jimmy," Hamish said softly, "I like my life exactly the way it is. I like the rain, I like the gossip, and I like being the man everyone thinks is too lazy to catch a cold. If Blair takes the glory, he'll stay in Strathbane and leave us in peace, and Geordie will be home by breakfast. That's enough for me." They began the slow trek down the hillside, a sombre procession of 3 men and a dog. The rain had started again, a gentle, persistent drizzle that felt like the land was trying to wash away the bitterness of the last 48 hours. As they reached the police van hidden in the shadows of the lower road, Hamish felt a sense of profound relief. The confrontation was over. The blue-faced ghost of Percival Vane could finally be laid to rest, and the midnight toast would become just another dark story told over drams in the Loch Dhu Arms. But first, there was the small matter of DCI Blair. Hamish knew the man would be waiting, ready to pounce on any mistake. He needed to ensure the transition of credit was seamless, or he'd find himself wearing a sergeant's stripes before the week was out. He patted Lugs on the head and climbed into the passenger seat, his mind already turning toward the best way to make himself look completely and utterly useless during the final briefing. The fluorescent lights of the Loch Dhu police station hummed with a clinical, irritating buzz that seemed to vibrate right through Hamish's skull. Inside the small front office, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool and the palpable, sulphurous rage of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. Blair was currently pacing the small floor space like a caged bull, his face a shade of crimson that suggested an imminent medical event. On the other side of the desk, young Geordie sat huddled in a chair, looking small and broken, while a junior detective tried in vain to find a way to make the boy's tearful denials sound like a confession. The moment the door opened and Hamish stepped in, followed by a sombre Jimmy Anderson and a handcuffed, mud-streaked Arthur Jenkins, the room fell into a sudden, suffocating silence. Blair spun around, his nostrils flaring. "What is this, Macbeth? I told you to stay at the gate. And why is Anderson with you? And why," he jabbed a thick, sausage-like finger at Arthur, "is this man in irons? Have you taken leave of your senses, or are you just trying to ruin my evening by arresting random bystanders?" Hamish did not respond with the sharp wit he had displayed on the cliffside. Instead, he allowed his shoulders to slump further, his head tilting in a manner that suggested a profound, almost terminal state of confusion. He fumbled with his cap, twisting it in his large hands, and looked toward Jimmy Anderson with an expression of pathetic dependency. "Och, sir, it's a terrible muddle," Hamish began, his voice a slow, mournful drawl. "I was just wandering the hills, looking for a sheep that Mrs. Ross said had gone astray. You know how the locals get about their livestock. And I stumbled upon Detective Anderson here. He was doing some proper police work, sir. He'd worked out some business about the old land deeds and the Jenkins family. I just happened to be standing there when this poor soul, Arthur, got a bit agitated. I'm afraid I was more of a hindrance than a help, really. I nearly tripped over my own feet when the scuffle started." Blair's eyes darted to Jimmy Anderson, who was standing stiffly, looking as though he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Jimmy took a deep breath, remembering the silent pact they had made in the van. "That's right, sir. I'd been doing some background checks on the property history of the Craggs. It occurred to me that the Jenkins family had a motive that went back generations. I followed a lead to the old sheep fank and, well, I found Arthur there. He had the evidence, sir, a second jar. He confessed to the whole thing, the poisoning, the swap at the pantry window, everything." Blair's jaw dropped, then closed as he processed the information. He looked at Arthur, who was staring at the floor in a state of catatonic defeat, then back at Jimmy. The prospect of a closed case, a confession, and a tidy forensic link was like oxygen to a drowning man. But he still looked at Hamish with suspicion. And what did Macbeth do? Did he at least hold the light? "He mostly just kept the dog out of the way, sir," Jimmy lied, his voice only slightly wavering. "In fact, I think he nearly let the suspect escape by being a bit slow on the uptake. If I hadn't stepped in with the handcuffs, we might have lost him over the ridge." Blair let out a sharp, barking laugh that was devoid of any humour. "Typical. I knew it. You're a liability, Macbeth, a total ginger-haired liability. You're lucky Anderson was there to do the thinking for you, or we'd be filling out missing persons reports for a murderer tonight." He turned his back on Hamish, his eyes now shining with the greedy light of a man who could see a commendation in his future. "Anderson, get this man into the back. Get the digital recording transcribed immediately. I want the Chief Constable informed that the Strathbane CID has successfully concluded the Vane investigation through diligent investigative legwork and superior tactical coordination." "And what about the boy, sir?" Hamish asked softly, pointing at Geordie. "Since he's innocent and all, get him out of here." Blair waved a hand dismissively. "He was a person of interest and he's been cleared. He should be grateful we didn't charge him with wasting police time. Go on, lad, get home before I change my mind." Geordie didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled out of the station, casting one look of pure, silent gratitude toward Hamish that the constable quickly ignored. Hamish stood there for a moment, the picture of a man who had been thoroughly sidelined and insulted, while Blair began barking orders into his telephone, already beginning the process of weaving a narrative that made him the hero of the Loch Dhu mystery. "As for you, Macbeth," Blair said, pausing his phone call to glare at the constable one last time, "I was going to suggest you for a transfer to the city just to get you some proper training, but looking at the mess you're in, I think you'd be a danger to the public in a place with traffic lights. You stay here in this damp little hole. It's all you're fit for. Now clear out. I've got a press release to draft." "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir," Hamish murmured, retreating toward the door with Lugs at his heels. "I'll just go and see that lost sheep then." As he stepped out into the cold night air, the heavy door of the station clicking shut behind him, Hamish felt the tension leave his body. The ruse had worked perfectly. Blair's arrogance was his greatest weakness, and by feeding that arrogance, Hamish had secured his own freedom. He had protected the village, saved an innocent boy from a life-altering conviction, and most importantly, he had ensured that no one in the higher echelons of the police force would ever think of him as promotable material. He was still just Hamish Macbeth, the lazy, slow-witted constable of a quiet Highland village, and that was exactly how he intended to stay. He walked down the street, the rain turning to a soft white sleet that began to dust the rooftops. He saw the lights of the hotel were still on, and he knew that within the hour, the story of Jimmy Anderson's brilliant detective work would be the talk of the bar. He didn't mind. In fact, it made him smile. The truth was a heavy thing to carry, and he was more than happy to let Jimmy and Blair shoulder the weight of it. As he reached his own small cottage, he looked up at the cliffs of the crags, now dark and silent against the stormy sky. The midnight toast conspiracy was over. The land had taken its toll, and the interlopers had been dealt with. He unlocked his door, the familiar scent of peat and old coffee welcoming him home. He didn't need a medal, and he certainly didn't need a sergeant's stripes. He had a warm fire, a loyal dog, and the peace of the Highlands, which was worth more than all the silver in London. He began to unbutton his tunic, his thoughts already turning to the remains of a mutton stew he had left in the larder. It had been a long day, and the most difficult part, pretending to be stupid for DCI Blair, was finally over. The following morning the sun finally broke through the heavy Highland mists, casting a pale golden light over the waters of Loch Dhu. The village seemed to exhale, a collective sigh of relief that the blue flashing lights and the shouting men from Strathbane had departed. The silver Jaguar had been towed away. Percival Vane was on his way to a refrigerated drawer in the city, and the Jenkins brothers' legacy had been sealed in a confession that would be debated over dreams of whiskey for the next 50 years. Inside the police station kitchen, the peat fire crackled with a cheery domestic rhythm. Hamish Macbeth was back in his natural habitat, dressed in an old moth-eaten sweater and a pair of corduroys that had seen better decades. He was carefully tending to a pot of coffee, the aroma mingling with the savoury steam rising from a small iron pot on the stove where a bit of poached salmon, gifted by a grateful Archie MacLean, was simmering with potatoes. Lugs lay stretched out across the hearth, his paws twitching as he chased imaginary rabbits in a sleep that was no longer interrupted by the sounds of violence on the cliffs. There was a light tap at the door, and Priscilla Halberton Smythe stepped inside, looking radiant in a cream-coloured knit. She carried a small basket of scones, still warm from the estate's ovens. She looked at Hamish, who was currently peering intently at the bubbles in his coffee pot, and she gave a knowing shake of her head. "I've just come from the village, Hamish," she said, setting the basket on the scarred wooden table. "The local consensus is that you're a very lucky man to have such a brilliant superior as DCI Blair and such a tenacious detective as Jimmy Anderson. They say you nearly ruined the whole arrest by getting lost in the heather." Hamish looked up, his hazel eyes twinkling with a dry, secret mirth. "Aye, it was a close-run thing, Priscilla. If it weren't for my own incompetence, I might have been expected to actually lead the interrogation. It's a heavy burden, being the village idiot, but someone has to do it for the sake of the peace." Priscilla sat down, watching him pour 2 mugs of the jet-black liquid. "You're a terrible liar, Hamish Macbeth. You solved that case before Blair even got his boots muddy. You knew about the Ponticum honey, you knew about the land deeds, and you certainly knew how to make Arthur Jenkins talk. Why do you let them treat you like a fool?" Hamish handed her a mug and sat opposite her, the warmth of the kitchen a shield against the rest of the world. because a fool is never expected to leave Priscilla. If I'm the hero, they'll want me in a suit, sitting in an office in Glasgow, looking at computer screens and filling out forms in triplicate. Out here I can listen to the wind, I can look after my neighbours, and I can make sure the real villains don't get away with more than they should. In the city, everyone's a number. In Lochdu, everyone's a story. I prefer the stories. And what of Arthur? She asked softly. It's a tragedy in its own way, a family destroyed by a man's greed, and their own inability to let go of the past. The Highlands don't forget easily, Hamish remarked, staring into the depths of his coffee. Vane tried to own the land, and the land responded. Arthur thought he was the hand of justice, but he was just another victim of the same bitterness. It's a cycle as old as the mountains. I just try to keep the wheels from crushing the innocent ones like Geordie. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that only exists between people who understand the unspoken rules of the North. Outside, the gulls cried over the harbour, and the postman's van rattled past, its engine a familiar, comforting sound. The midnight toast conspiracy was already receding into the archives of village gossip, becoming just another layer of history in a place where the past was never truly dead. Eventually Priscilla rose to leave, pausing at the door to look back at the tall, red-haired man who seemed so perfectly at home in his humble surroundings. "You'll never change, will you, Hamish? You'll be sitting in that chair 20 years from now, still dodging promotions and still being the smartest man in the county." "I certainly hope so," Hamish replied with a grin, "though I wouldn't mind a better stove. This one's been acting up since the winter of 22. Once she was gone, Hamish whistled for Lugs. The dog stood up, shaking himself and yawning widely. The sun was high enough now for a walk along the shore, a chance to check on the lobster pots and perhaps see if the sea had washed up anything interesting during the storm. There would be no more murders today, no more shouting inspectors, and no more blue-faced Sassenachs demanding the impossible. He pulled on his old tweed jacket, settled his cap on his head, and stepped out into the crisp, salt-scented air. He walked down the path toward the loch, a solitary figure against the vast, rugged beauty of the landscape. To the world he was just a lazy constable in a forgotten corner of the world. But as Hamish Macbeth looked out over the sparkling water, he knew better. He had the best job in the world, and as long as he kept everyone believing he was a fool, he'd never have to give it up. The village was quiet, the mountains were still, and for Hamish Macbeth that was the greatest victory.